Helen Brahms here, coming to you live from Surprise in Arizona. Hope you're having a super fantastic, sparkling day. Welcome to Before the Dirt Nap podcast number 1931, Wild Wednesday. Kind of feel like my hair's a little on the wild side. But anyway, so what are we talking about tonight? Tonight we're talking about Wild Wednesday, the things your ancestors may have gotten up to. They were a little on the wild side. We're talking about things like, let's just start at the top and work our way down. I got a list. I have a list, including some places where you can maybe find some of this information. So how about crossing an ocean to start a new life? Immigrating to a new country was a wild adventure, often involving weeks or months at sea with unknown risks. Many ancestors took this leap into the unknown to build a better life. Some people got forced into it, going from England down to Australia as a convict. And then there were others that that were sent down there to help colonize Australia. There were also people sent to New Zealand to help colonize there as well. They're going into the great unknown. They have no idea what's going to happen when they get there. All they're getting are these reports that have come back that are months old. And all of a sudden they decide to uproot everything and move. You even have those that just went across the we call it the pond from New Zealand to Australia, but it's not that. So across the channel from Europe, from England across the way there to Canada and the US. No idea what they were getting themselves in for. They were just getting sent over there, or they may have volunteered to go over there because they had heard of the good things. How can you find out these records? Just look up for ship manifests. For the passenger lists, and checking on passenger lists, checking on census reports. When were they last in England? When did they reappear somewhere else in the world on a different census report? Look at records like that. There will also be articles. Can you find? There may be criminal records that you can find on the convicts that were sent to Australia. There are records there from court hearings. There is passenger lists for convict voyages, convict ships that were sent to Australia with the people on board there as well. There's also different police records that are out there that you can find things in. I've got some good stories for you tonight. So, go and think. Participating in a gold rush. Ancestors may have been among those who rushed to places like California, Australia, New Zealand, the Yukon in search of gold, many risking everything, enduring harsh conditions, and only few struck it rich. Some even gave up before they found the vein, and then somebody else came along afterwards and took over their claim and found a major vein that opened everything up. So you can find records for those. I know, and there's Arrowtown in New Zealand. Sorry, momentary lapse. Which was a gold mining community. Now a big tourist spot down there, and they have the whole history there of the gold mining thing. There's a lot of Chinese people that came down to New Zealand during the gold rush days and helped work the mines and the claims and things like that as well. And you can go they've got different places. They've got a museum down there. You can go wandering. You can find out all the information about. I got really wild here today. Sorry. That's got all the history about the gold mine rush that was there in New Zealand. A lot of places where the gold rushes took place have different museums and stuff dedicated to that sort of thing. I know when I was in Skagway was where the ships would drop off people who would then have to transport their stuff from the beach all the way up into the Yukon. And it was harrowing. They showed photographs of these people trenching through snow with just a small amount of their claim. They had to leave a lot of their personal items the items that they had brought with them on the beach because they didn't have the manpower they had to lug stuff up, then get all the way back down again and hope that their stuff was still there and hope that it was above the tide line in order to pick up another load to stretch it all the way up to the Yukon. It was not an easy walk at all. Not at all. This is before trains were around. And they just had to hope like heck when they got back to the beach that their stuff would still be there so they could then pick up the next load and take that up as well. And they would just basically go in there'll be this long line of people with these big boxes on their backs that they were carrying along with whatever they were carrying in their hands. They would carry as much as they possibly could during this time. How do you find out about it? Go to the local museums. Go for a trip to Skagway. I tell you, Skagway is a great little town. I love Skagway. It's awesome. Been there a couple of times. Absolutely loved it every time. And every time I've seen something different when I've gone there. But they have this great visitors center there with all of this information there for you. They have a museum set up that you can wander through. You learn about the train line being put in. You learn all about them walking from the beach up to where their claim was, up in the Yukon and things like that. How long it would take them to get up there, how long it would take them to get back. People who have fallen over just fallen off the trail and died, and all sorts of things that they had to go through. There's names up there. There's there's records that you can find with the claims on who claimed different different areas, where they had their claim and stuff for their gold rush hunt. It was rough. It was rough back then. It was really, really hard. So go to those areas. If you've had that rumor in your family about an ancestor going to one of those gold rush areas during the gold rush times, then go to those areas, look at their local museum. They've got records there and everything else, and see what records you can find, and see and learn about what it was like during the gold rush, how rough it was, what their conditions were like that they lived in. I mean, some of them just lived in horrendous conditions in the hope of striking it big. And meanwhile, they had borrowed money from family and friends back home. They were gone for months, even years, just trying to keep their claim alive so that they could keep looking and hoping to hit that major vein of gold. It's a very interesting stories from different places. It's interesting. The places have similar stories, but also very different stories as well. So check those out. Maybe they fought in duels or feuds. Duels and feuds and family rivalries were surprisingly common in the past. If there's a family tale about a duel or a long-standing feud, check into it a little bit. You've got the what was the one in West Virginia, Kentucky border, McCoy and Hatfield. That was like a huge feud that went on. Did you have any relatives that lived in the area during the time? Maybe you're descended from some of the McCoys or the Hatfields, and it's part of your legacy. What other ones are out there? There was times when somebody had done a woman wrong, and the family would then come together, and either the father or the brother or even the betrothed would fight for the woman's honor. And I just thought it was so romantic. Pistols at dawn or swords or whatever it was that they had. What feuds, and if it was a big feud, like Hatfield and McCoy, there's a lot of documentation out there about that. And the stories behind it and everything else. And so you can find, if there was feuds or duels and things, you can find information in family records about those events, especially because they were put there that they were killed, and how did they die? They fought in a duel, things like that. So check those records out too. Maybe in the death certificate it has that they died from wounds received in a duel. You never know. They joined a traveling circus or a vaudeville troupe. Some ancestors led lives on the road as entertainers, performing in circuses, on stage, traveling musicians. There's records and photos of these that can reveal these colorful characters. I always remember, I think it was Susan Sarandon. Yes, Susan Sarandon wanted to know where her entertainment side came from, her love of the theater and that came from. And when she was on Who Do You Think You Are, they went back and found out that her grandmother, so her mother's mother, used to be a dance hall girl in New York City. And they named the particular dance hall she used to be in. It was one that was frequented by people like Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Dean Martin, all that crew were in there. And she never knew that about her grandmother because her mother would never talk about her mother. And so this is how Susan Sarandon found out about her grandmother's lifestyle, and was absolutely fascinated with the story of her grandmother and being a dance girl and in the dance halls and things. So now she knew where her love for the theater came from. But there's stories out there like this, and there are places where they have back issues of all of the different playbills from all the different shows that may have taken place in a theater that will have the cast listed in there. There'll be photographs. There'll be a lot of memorabilia around. There's a museum on just about anything, and probably anything. If you can think of it, there may be a museum for it. You never know. I mean, you go to Prague, it's like the Museum of Museums. They go in there, and we walked down one street on our walking tour of Prague, And on, I kid you not, on one side of the street, it had the Torture Museum. And we looked into the courtyard, which was the entry into the museum. And there's these 4 giant pistols. I don't even know what type of guns they were supposed to be, but there's 4 giant ones. They were huge. And they were all pointing at each other across the courtyard. They were all positioned. There was 4 of them, all positioned. So they're like, they had to put the person in the middle and hope like heck that nobody missed, or they'd shoot their mate across the other side there, I guess. And then on the other side was a sex museum. I kid you not. Torture on one side, sex museum on the other one. And it was just sort of like, oh, they have that in the lobby? Okay, we'll just keep on walking. And there was just, and those are the 2 that stuck out of my mind, but I know that there were other ones along that same street, but those are the 2 that just stuck in my mind because I was just sort of like, they have a museum on this? Apparently so. So, you can find museums on just about anything. And you can find, especially about the traveling circuses and things, there's always programs out there about the circus coming into town, about the theater, about traveling musicians and things. They'll be recorded in their local newspapers that were there as well. So you want to check old newspapers to see what they have written in there about events that took place during that time. Oh, one of the biggest gun battles. Oh my gosh. OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. You go down there, and OK Corral was it's actually quite interesting when you go there because the gunfight was not at the OK Corral. It was across the street from the OK Corral. It was next to a boarding house. And they actually have in a fenced-off area next to the boarding house, they have statues representing the people that took place in the gun battle that lasted all of 8 seconds. And every now and again, the animation comes alive, and they like have this big shoot, and you press the button, and they start this little animation thing, and it's all over in like about 10 seconds. And it's got the people standing where those people actually stood during the gunfight of the OK Corral. Then across the road where the actual OK Corral is, across the courtyard there, they actually do a lot. They do reenactments in there as well. Really, really cool place to go and have a look. And it's a Big Nose Kate was Doc Halliday's girl, and her room overlooked the entire event, yet she was never called to be a witness for that event. So maybe you could find stories, something similar to that, that was, and of course, with the ticket that I had for that day, it let me in to see all of the museum area of it, plus go see the live show of the gunfight, then go into the diorama, the historic diorama, which talks about Tombstone and the history of Tombstone, how it keeps getting burnt down and it keeps just rebuilding, burns down, rebuilds. As they call it, the town that never dies. Then you take that ticket down to the newspaper office, and you actually get a complimentary copy of the newspaper report of the battle at the OK Corral, and it's got all the newspaper, and it's the full newspaper that was printed on that day. The day after everything took place. And so there's not just that story in there, there's other stories in there. It's really interesting. And they have other newspapers that you can purchase, and they weren't that expensive. So I've got a few. I can't dig them out right now because I don't know exactly which box that they're in. But I do remember getting those when she's playing with her treat she's playing with her afternoon snack, if you can believe that. So you could go and find places like that and go to their then where the newspapers were printed and have a look at their archival copies. Maybe you can get a copy of an original work there that you can take home that shows the articles that included your ancestors. All right, so we're up to run away to enlist in the military. It wasn't uncommon for underage boys to lie about their age to enlist in the army, especially during times of war. Their records may tell tales of early enlistment or embellished ages. And this you can find out by looking at the enrollment. A lot of places you can look up the enlistment records of those that enlisted, the draft records as well. And you will know if you've already found their birth certificate and their baptismal records and maybe, all their information up until that point, you may turn around and go, well, hang on. In that year, they would have only been 15. Yet they went and registered and went off to war, and there's a whole, and then you go look at something like Folder 3 and you find their military records there. What the heck's going on? Yeah, they lied about their age so that they could go and fight. They did not want to be left at home. They wanted to go fight. So you've got records, there's records there of 14, 15, 16, and 17-year-old kids signing up to go away and fight in wars. I kid you not. Some of them were young, but some of them got away with it because they actually looked older than what they were. They were big for their age. So they were able to get away with it a little more. Outlaw or criminal history. Some ancestors may have lived on the wild side, committing crimes, even becoming infamous outlaws. Criminal records, prison logs, and newspaper articles often provide juicy details. And you can find all sorts of stories in newspapers. Whenever I go and look at a newspaper for an obituary announcement, a wedding announcement, a birth announcement, I always go back and have a look at the front page to see what was the headlines of that day. I also look at the advertisements too to see what was the trends at that time, what was the pricing like. And you find some very interesting stories in there. And it's so like you find these stories of people who have been convicted of all sorts of things from robberies to murders to protests to all sorts of things are in the newspaper there. And it's like, wonder whose genealogy line they fit into. Oh, well, that's where my brain goes. Sorry. It's just crazy like that. So you can find different stories there as well. Those that settled the frontier. Many ancestors were among the first to settle in wild, untamed lands. Frontier life was harsh, requiring rugged survival skills and independence, often in extreme isolation. And these you can find in land records. When they had the land grabs or they issued parcels of land, you'll find the deeds for those lands that have been recorded with your ancestors' names on them. And you'll find when that deed was granted to them. You can look on maps to see where they were, so you will know if they were in the frontier or if they were settling a new county or town. Things like, go look for things like that as well. You'll be surprised at what you can find. Worked in dangerous jobs. Coal miners, lumberjacks, railroad builders often face life-threatening conditions daily. Occupational records may reveal the wild risks taken just to make a living. My third, hang on. Let's see. Bullen, he was my third great-grandfather, was killed in a mining accident. There was a whole newspaper report printed up about it. He wasn't the only person to die that day in the mining accident. No, I think he might have been the only person that day. But there was a lot of mining accidents in New Zealand, and my third great-grandfather was one of the ones that was killed in a mining accident. Hang on, I'm just trying to think. It was my third great, might be my second great-grandfather. Hang on. Nana. No, other side. Papa, Jane. No, hang on. Was the other side. It was my mother's side of the family. And it was her grandmother or her great-grandmother. That's where I can't remember if it was the second or the third. But, you can find reports on mining accidents in newspapers. You can also find them in the mining records as well, where they have to do investigations. Coroner's reports. I tell you, coroner's reports are awesome to find information. If there was an inquest into an ancestor's death, they are just amazing to read. My third great-grandfather drowned in a river in New Zealand. He was on a barge and he fell off the barge in May. They didn't find his body till August. So that was during our winter months in New Zealand. And when they found his body, they took it into the local pub. And I tell you, the local taverns, pubs, inns, they were used for everything in small towns. They were where school was held, where church services were held, where they had the regular bar things. Any inquests were held there. Any court cases were held. It was like a community center. And everything was held in this place because the town was so small that they didn't have needs for separate buildings for different things. They just did everything in the pub. And so when they took him out of the river, they took him into the local pub, pushed a couple of tables together, put his body, I know, this is gross, put his body on the tables while they held an inquest. And my mum and I are in the National Archives, and this was in their old building, and it was very dusty, and it had that musty, dusty library smell that I absolutely love. And we get this, and we're pouring. I actually have a photocopy of the actual coroner's thing, of the coroner's report, and it's very, very enlightening. And in the report is all of the witnesses that they had on how they identified the body. Was this Henry Brazier? And Henry Brazier. Was this him? He was my third great grandfather. How did they know that this was him? And they interviewed his workmates as to how they were doing an inquest. Is the fact that his death was by drowning, but it was by accidental drowning. So they had to clarify: was it murder? Was he pushed off a barge? Did he fall off the barge accidentally? How did they know it was this guy? How did they know it was Henry Brazier? And one of his workmates and they interviewed his widow. They interviewed all of his workmates, neighbors, everybody in this inquest report. And it's all handwritten out. And one of his workmates was able to identify that, yes, this is Henry Brazier. And they asked him how he could tell that. And he says, because of the boots on his feet. And they said, what's so special about the boots on his feet? And he said they were made specifically to go around the corns that were on his feet. My mother and I read that. And you know how when you're in a really quiet place where you're basically talking a whisper of a whisper, very, very quiet, and this was a traditional like library thing where you don't make noise and you're just being very, very quiet, and all of a sudden you get a fit of the giggles. Yeah, that kind of happened with us when we read the description about the corns about the boots being made to. That's how my third great grandfather was identified. It was because of the corns on the boots made to go around the corns on his feet. We found that quite amusing. So that's looking at dangerous jobs. I can't remember. He worked on the barges on the river, so the possibility of falling off, absolutely a high risk. Engaged in Prohibition era bootlegging. Prohibition led some to take up the wild and illegal trade of bootlegging alcohol. Family stories or legal records might hint at ancestors' involvement in this business. If you go up to Ketchikan has a great story about Prohibition. Alaska was put into Prohibition before continental US was put into Prohibition. At the time, they were only a territory of the United States. This is before they became part of the United States. They were just a territory at the time, and they got put into Prohibition. Now, if you go to Creek Street is full of really, really cool stories and lots of information. They have these poles there with these boards that have got copies of newspaper articles and other things on it. I took copious photographs of these things just so I could go back and read the articles. And this is where I found out that a nip of bootlegged alcohol was 50 cents a nip, and a nip was half a teaspoon. And I'm just like, wait, what? and Creek Street became the red light district of Ketchikan. It has a fascinating story. It is really, really cool story. But during the Prohibition, the boats and the bootleg was started being called hooch because of the native Indian tribe that was there. It was named after them. So the story goes on one of the signs that one of the newspaper article thingies up there. But what they used to do is that they used to pull the boats underneath, because the houses on Creek Street were built out over the creek. So there was water that was water underneath the houses. So these guys that were selling the hooch would then pull themselves along underneath the buildings and the piers that were there, because they just had to have the walkway as well. And then they would tap on a trapdoor, which would then open. There would be an exchange of booze for money, and then they would go on to the next one. And the place that they delivered the booze to would then hide their stash of booze, because they found out it was okay to lose one bottle instead of their whole stash. So they only ever had one bottle open at a time in the dance hall, in the brothel, whatever the place of business was. And you get all of these guys coming in, paying their 50 cents to get half a teaspoon of booze. And it turned out that selling the booze was actually more profitable than the prostitutes selling their wares were. So it was, an interesting time to be in. And in the information that I've read later on about Ketchikan and after Prohibition and stuff, when they actually went to refurbish all the buildings in the 1960s, I think it was 1960s. I think that's right. When they were going in to refurbish these buildings and everything else along Creek Street, they were finding stashes of the bootlegged booze still in their hiding places. So I'm just sort of like, wow, they paid all that money and left it all behind. So you can find interesting stories like this. And then when it comes to, were my ancestors involved in it? Look up the records. Were they ever prosecuted for it? Was there newspaper articles about it? Is there a rumor in the family that you can perhaps go and confirm that that's what happened? You know how NASCAR got started? Now, this is an interesting story about NASCAR. It got started when the bootleggers used to race each other. They'd pick up the moonshine. This was all about moonshine. They pick up the moonshine and then they would race each other to the destination. But then there was, and so they would, miss the cops and all that, and try and miss the law enforcement and everything else. But then when they lost, they were sort of like, oh, well, I got held up by the law. I had to lose the law enforcement that was on my tail. I had to do this. I had to do that. The stream was flooded across the road. They would come out with all these excuses. So then they started finding fields and just started racing around the fields. And then people were coming and watching them. And the farmers did not like the fact that their fields were getting torn up by race cars, so started charging admission. That was the beginning of NASCAR. Interesting history. Started from bootleggers. So you can even go through NASCAR records to find out who some of the earlier racers used to be. Maybe it was somebody in your family who used to be a bootleg runner. Yeah, a moonshine runner. You never know. Participated in secret societies. Organizations like Freemasons, Oddfellows, fraternal societies had secretive, realistic elements that can seem mysterious and wild to modern descendants. Some of these places will not release their records or tell you if somebody used to be in their society. I'm not sure. I haven't had to go look up anybody in the Freemasons. I know my grandfather was part of the Freemasons, but I've got no idea how to confirm that. Well, I used to see his lodge stuff hanging in his closet. He had this really cool closet. You could climb. This closet was so far off the floor that you could climb up in there, and then it had a shelf that you could go and hide in as well. It was a really cool closet to go hide in and play in and things like that when I was growing up. I loved that closet. It was awesome. You can go hide in there and hide from my grandparents, and they'd never find us. And it was up high enough for him because he was over 6 foot. And so he didn't need it to be down on the ground level. He just wanted everything handy for him. So his shoes would sit on the floor of his closet that was about 2 to 3 feet off the ground. But we used to love clambering up in there. It was a great place to go hide. Some organizations, if you ask them and say it's for genealogy purposes, some may or may not help you. The only other way would be if there's any public records or that they used to be part of that. Or if you find photographs of them dressed in whatever they got dressed in at the time for their meetings and things. If they undertook long wagon or train journeys, many families traveled across the country in covered wagons or on early railroads, braving tough conditions and the unknown as they headed west. There are a lot of journals out there from those times, from the wagon trails, the train rides, or there's a lot of journals out there. There's a lot of newspaper articles that got written about when a wagon train arrived in town, and it may mention some of the people that were in there. I was on my genealogy class last year. This one takes place every year. It's a week long. And in the evening ones, they were talking about using other people's stories to fill in the gap on your family's stories. And so the guy who was doing the presentation, great presentation, he was talking about how there was this gap when they knew that his second great-grandfather, I think it was, left this place, was living in this place. And then later on, he was living over, across the country in a different place. How did he get there? Well, they suspected that he was on a certain wagon train. And so they started researching that wagon train, and they got to a particular area. And in that area, there was actually newspaper articles written about that wagon train coming into town. And they found his second great grandfather was mentioned in the articles. They even found people's journals that named his second great grandfather. And so he was able to use other people's work to help fill in the gaps of his ancestor and how he went across the country on this train. So they were able to follow it to a certain point. Then he got left in a town. I can't remember the reasoning why, but it's all explained in the journals and the newspaper articles that he was going to be staying. Oh, and I think church records as well. I think there was a missionary one that they were doing on that wagon train. But he was able to piece together why his ancestor had to stay in this particular town because of what people have written in newspaper articles and in journals as well. So keep an eye out for those. You never know what you're going to find. Eloped or had a scandalous romance. Ooh, some ancestors had wild love lives, eloping without family approval or having dramatic star-crossed romances. Elopement records and family stories may reveal these romantic rebels. There are places that were known during those days for those that wanted to elope. You can go find the records there. I even found a wedding notice for somebody in my tree. I don't think it was a direct. I think it was a side branch that I was looking at because I was trying to find information for the main trunk line. So I was on one of the side branches. And I looked at this record and I went, this one says that parental approval was needed. Now, in those days, any woman under the age of 18 had to have under the age of 16. Might have been 16. I think it was 16 and under. It was a different one to what we have today. Well, under the age of, what was it? 18 or 16. If they were under that age, they had to have parental consent. That was for the women. The men had to be, if they were under the age of 21, they had to have parental consent. So I'm like, okay, so a 16-year-old girl could get married to a 19-year-old guy, and the girl would be fine, but the guy has to get parental consent. That's interesting. So it was just weird and wacky times during those times. And if you go to like the popular places that were known as, Gretna Green in Scotland was one of the places that were known for elopements, and where parental consent wasn't needed or things like that. And you can find those records and trace your ancestors there. So if you can't find if your family lived in England and you can't find an ancestor's marriage records, go across the border into Scotland and see what you can find, because you may just find that they eloped. I was looking for a friend for her. I was looking for a friend for her parents, and I says, "Hey, I thought you said your parents got married and named the state." And she goes, "Well, they did. That's what Mum always told me." I says, "Her marriage record is for the state next door." She's like, "Really?" And so I send her a copy of the record. And she went and asked her mother and found out that her mother and her father had eloped. So you never know. Through family stories and things like that, you never know. Some of them may have had a second wedding because the family didn't recognize the elopement, and so said, if you're going to get married, you're going to get married here, and they had to have a second wedding. So you may find records on that as well. And even scandalous romances. Back in, you're looking at interracial marriages as well. That could have taken place as being a scandalous romance. It could have been cousins that were getting married. There's all sorts of different things that people considered scandalous over time that you might need to go and have a look at. Maybe it was somebody from Europe getting married to a Native American Indian. That sort of thing. It could have been somebody in the South getting married to a slave back in the days, or they had escaped north in order to get married, because down in the South at that time, this is pre-Civil War, they wouldn't have been allowed to intermingle or anything, so they escaped to the north and got married up there. There were stories like that going around as well. So you can find those sorts of stories out there. They may be reported in a newspaper because some of the marriages would have been against the law with who you got married to. So when they were caught, they were then charged and had a trial to find out if they were guilty or not. So you'll find those records as well, and they'll be written up in the newspaper. Those that have lived through natural disasters, surviving events like hurricanes, earthquakes, fires, was a wild experience that left lasting impacts on families. Records and personal accounts capture their resilience. These you can find in newspapers, a lot of newspapers. I had one client who I was looking into her family tree for her, and she told me about her aunt who had passed away due to this massive fire. Well, as soon as she said it was a major fire, I went straight to the newspapers, found the article, was then able to find the aunt's death certificate, and that, yes, she did die from her injuries from the fire. So there's stuff like that you can find. The census reports will tell you where people were living at the time when disasters struck. Where you're like the San Francisco earthquake. Excuse me. What relatives did you have living in that area? Were there death announcements did they die shortly after the earthquake? Was it from injuries sustained in the earthquake? Even the death certificate may have on there things like died from injuries sustained in, and then whatever the hurricane, the fire, the earthquake, it will be listed on their death certificate. So you may find that. You'll also find newspaper articles around that time as well that will have the names of those involved that passed from injuries sustained in whatever the disaster was at the time. You may even find family journals that talk about their experience during that time and how they picked things up and either moved from that area or they rebuilt in that area. You'll get those stories as well. And again, newspaper articles, great source of information for that. Changed identities or names. Oh my gosh, this is so much fun to try and unravel. Some ancestors reinvented themselves, changing their names or creating new identities for various reasons, escaping debt, starting fresh, hiding past mistakes. They may have been married may have had 2 families. Yes, that has happened as well. If they've been caught, newspaper articles are great for this. My 7th cousins who live in Wales, their great-grandmother, for some reason, changed her name. We still, to this day, don't know why. And it's a great mystery in the family as to why she changed her name. She didn't change her last name. She just changed her first name. Nobody knows why or how that even got changed. We can't find any stories about it, can't find any journals about it, but you can find things. I met another cousin. She's I think it was 3rd cousin once removed, I think she is. And we're chatting backwards and forwards through Ancestry because we had a DNA match. And she said, well, I'm trying to find more information about this. But this particular, her father or grandfather, it's either her father or her grandfather, kept changing his name. Like they know how many times he got married. And like one time he actually kept his first name, but used his wife's maiden name in one instance. In another instance, he used like his grandmother's maiden. He would switch out his name. He would put his middle name as his last name. He would take maiden names from wives, and he had several wives. He would take one of their maiden names and stick it on the end of his. So they never actually knew they were trying to figure out what his first name was. But I think we finally got it figured out what his original name was, and then trying to track him after that became a little bit of a challenge. But because he always kept some part of his name, we were able to track some things where there's a high probability that this is the same person. So fingers crossed that we keep finding this information and finding little more. I tell you, DNA has uncovered a lot. There's several Facebook groups that I'm in where they're all talking about ancestry DNA and all of that sort of thing. And the number of people that come up, and because of the number of centimorgans, they want to say, well, according to these centimorgans, the ancestry, they're telling me that this is my half brother, my half nephew, my half aunt, my blah, 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 blah. And I'm sort of like, please go just trace your genealogy. And when they trace the genealogy along with the DNA, they find, because I will tell you this from personal experience, that ancestry, when it turns around and says, this is on your maternal side, this is your 3rd or 4th cousin on your paternal side, your father's side of the family. And you go looking and hunting and you're talking backwards and forwards with this person, and then you find, what was your mother's name? And then all of a sudden everything clicks into place, and she's my 3rd, and this woman turned out to be my 3rd cousin on my mother's side of the family. Nothing to do with my dad's side. There may be a connection somewhere along the way where she is on my dad's side of the family as well, but to date we have it because there's a lot of surnames in her family tree that appear on my dad's side of the family. But her mother is most definitely on my mother's side of the family. We already have that. It's cemented. We know that for a fact. We have totally proven that. On my dad's side, there could be a relationship based on all the surnames that are in her tree that are also on my dad's side of the tree, which could be why Ancestry turned around and said, this is on your paternal side. Who knows? But if it turns around and says, oh, this could be your 3rd cousin on your paternal side, take it as a guide, and that's it. Don't trust it. Prove it through the genealogy. Actually go research, because the DNA could be wrong. They had my aunt listed as my 1st cousin. And I'm like, she's not my 1st cousin. She's my aunt. So you do have to be careful when Ancestry predicts that this could be a certain cousin, a niece, a half nephew, all of that sort of stuff. Because people are then getting worried, a half sibling. People get very worried when they see the half sibling thing. And I'm like, it is a prediction that could be completely wrong. But DNA will uncover other siblings that you may not know about. Be they half siblings, be they full siblings, you might never know. They may uncover ones that you didn't even know you had. You may find adopted families this way. If you've been adopted, you may find your natural family this way. So there's all sorts of different things that DNA can help you do, but you have to research the genealogy side of it as well, because DNA proves that you're blood related. Genealogy proves how you're related. DNA can't tell you how you're related, but genealogy can. And you put the two together and it's pretty magical. And then the last one I have on my list, they stood up for a cause or protested, whether it was fighting for women's rights, labor reforms, or other social causes. Ancestors who were activists took wild, brave stands to change society. And this would be in newspapers like crazy. I have two second great grandmothers that I know of who signed the suffragette petition in New Zealand, which then gave women the right to vote in 1893. We were the first country in the world to allow women the vote in 1893. In the United States here, it didn't happen until the 1930s when they sent around and says, yeah, you guys can vote for presidents. So in 1893, I actually have seen online copies of the petitions that two of my great grandmothers signed. One of them, they've got lines all and everybody's signed on a line. One of them on my dad's side, my second great grandmother on my dad's side, hers is not written on a line. It is like at the bottom of the page, between the bottom of the page and the last line is where she signed it. But what's really cool about seeing these petitions and things is you get to see your ancestors' handwriting. It is awesome. It is so cool. It's my second great grandmother's handwriting. It is really cool. I don't know about other people, but I get chills when I get to see something that an ancestor of mine wrote. It just makes it more personable. So, and again, it was something that took place in history, and so two of my second great grandmothers that I know of signed these petitions and were part of the woman suffragette movement that took place in the 1890s. And, like I said, women in New Zealand were granted the right to vote in 1893. So there you go. I had two great grandmothers involved in that movement. Very proud of them. They're absolutely incredible women. From the stories, I mean, the one that signed on between the bottom line and the bottom of the page, she was the second wife of my second great grandfather. His first wife had passed away, so she got married. So he got married again to my second great grandmother. They had one child before he passed away. So my great grandfather and one of my second great grandfather's children from his first marriage all went down to got on a ship and went down to Australia, and then they eventually ended up in New Zealand. And I'm just like thinking, that's pretty crazy. A single mom with a toddler. My great grandfather was like 5, I think he was when they came down. He was born in when was he born? 1878. His dad died they were on the 1881 census in England. Then my second great grandfather passed away, and then they came down to New Zealand in the early 1880s. And I thought, to go that distance with a toddler, and I don't recall how old the stepdaughter was, or she would have been my aunt. Yeah, aunt, great aunt, half great aunt, my half great grand aunt. I don't know, there's a lot of these. And she would have been my half because I'm only related to her through blood through my second great grandfather. So it's a half. So she's my half great grand aunt. Yes, you even have those, so you got to figure out too. Go figure. It's a lot of fun. And she took the ship from England down. I think they went to Australia first, then New Zealand. Or did they go straight to New Zealand? No, Australia first, then New Zealand, where she ended up. And of course, then she had to start a brand new life there as a single mother. She never got married again. And she was part of the women's suffragette movement that was down there. I was like, this is amazing. And then my other second great grandmother who was involved with the suffragette movement was on my mum's side of the family. And she is an incredible woman. She had a very hard life. She was married twice. Her first husband was killed in a mining accident. And so she was left with 4. I'm trying to remember how many. I think it was 4 children. No, she had lost 2. 2 of her sons had passed away and they were buried with their dad. And so she had 3 surviving children, I think it was, one of them being my great-grandmother. Then she got married again and had a parcel of kids with her second husband. One of them, who, if you have been following my stories and everything else, turned out to be like one of the worst criminals in Australia. There's a book that's called Australia's Worst Criminals with a question mark. And each person in that book has a chapter, and Lars has an entire chapter to himself. He was a Nazi sympathizer. He embezzled money from the Nazis. While in Australia during the Second World War, he kept claiming that he was not New Zealand. He was born off the coast of California. He was German. He was claiming all these things, and they kept tripping him up in his lies. He was a tyrant. He was a really bad landlord. He would turn off the water on his apartment buildings. He would turn off the heat during the middle of winter. He was just really bad. They had online, so I've downloaded them, copies of his arrest record for treason in Sydney. And it's all written in pencil on this form. It's really cool. I got to see this. It's really cool. And it's amazing what you find. And then he was released like 2 or 3 days later, and then he was rearrested 4 days later, like within a week. So within a week, he'd been arrested twice for treason against the state or against Australia. And this is when he was making all these wild claims that he was American, he was Canadian. And I even found the index cards of the case that had been sent to the American embassy, and it had been sent to America to verify that he was an American. And he said, all my records were destroyed during the San Francisco earthquake. And they were going, he ain't here. Then he was claiming he was born off the coast of California. And then he was claiming that he was German. And everybody was like, nope. He said he didn't know who his mother was, yet his mother, my second great grandmother, would go across to Australia and visit him while he was in prison. And he's claiming he didn't know who his mother was. And all of this. And I'm like, I know exactly where you were born. I got a copy of your birth certificate. I got it, it was just, and at that time they didn't. And at that time, if you were from New Zealand, the Australians had no way to send you back to New Zealand. Like New Zealand had no way to send Australians back to Australia. There was no extradition between the two. So the Australians were stuck with this guy. And it was after one of his, a few days after my second great grandmother got back. And so she had to deal with all of this, right? She had to deal with her husband being killed in a mining accident, losing 2 of her children, raising the other 3, getting married to this other guy, having this parcel of kids, having this one turning out to be a tyrant, and getting arrested and all of this sort of stuff. And then later in life, she had been over to Australia to visit him while he was in prison. And she came back, and a few days later, she passed away. And she passed away, and my grandmother at the time was about 10 or 11 at the time when this happened. And she used to tell my mum stories about how she remembered when her grandmother passed away, so my second great-grandmother, when she passed away, and how they had to take the pantry door off and lay it across the table because the table was not long enough for my second great-grandmother to lay on so that they could prepare her body for burial. Just all the crazy stories that come. I tell you, there's wild stories about there. There's wild stories in every single family out there. You just got to find them. You just got to know where to look. Newspaper articles, family stories, journals, also, just different records that are held in different places and things. If you need some help looking, give me a call. Private message me. I'm happy to help. Always happy to help. So that's all I have on my list for you today. Oh, crikey, you've gone almost an hour. Whew, I didn't expect to go this long, but that's such a really cool topic to talk about. And I've got so many wild stories that I've just found in my own tree, as well as in trees of my clients, that I have found as well. I must get permission from that one client to see if I can tell her story and put the names in there so you can see how crazy this whole thing was with her and and her great, her second great grandmother, her third great grandmother, her fourth great grandmother, their wild stories, who they were related to, and all that sort of stuff. It's just crazy. But with that, I am out of here. Yes. So if you want to help looking for wild stories, just private message me and we can set up a time to just have an initial discussion about what it is that you're looking for and how we can help you. And maybe it could be just coaching you on doing your own research. We can either do the research for you or we can coach you on how to find these records. So with that, we are out of here. Go out, have a super fantastic sparkling evening, and we'll catch you guys back here tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. Pacific. Hei konera.